The wall in Game of Thrones is quite literally a colossal mystery. It is a giant wall of ice that stretches across the entirety of the continent, and nobody knows how it was built. In fact, there's not even really any plausible theories as to how it was actually physically created. Until now. There are basically two main camps to explain how the wall was built in the story, the conventional explanation coming from the Maesters being that blocks of ice taken from the lakes in the north were carved out and hauled up and stacked up one by one, and that's how you get the wall. The more magical explanation given is that Bran the Builder in the Age of Heroes teamed up with the Children of the Forest and they did some magic spells, possibly with the help of giants, and they created the wall to keep away something evil and locked in the north. I don't think it will surprise anyone to realize that that is closer to the truth, that it was in fact using some form of magic rather than actually physically stacking blocks of ice, but I have, I believe, identified the specific magical means by which the wall was created, and the specific hints that George R. R. Martin has laid out, and the foreshadowing, and it all seems to work physically, magically, and thematically, so all of it lines up. So let's just get into it right away. One of the main things that we need to explain about the wall is how it is that the wall is able to weep and have water come off of it as a giant ice cube, and yet it never shrinks smaller. There is some mechanism by which water is returned to the wall and refrozen, and the wall can rebuild itself. This is talked about in the books. It's always referred to that the wall is weeping when it's warm. It starts right from the very first prologue that the wall is referred to as weeping, and it's a constant thing that we should be looking for an answer to. This is the first thing that I pieced together that allowed me to figure out how the wall was built, because I figured out how the wall can repair itself and get more water into it once it weeps and that water goes down into the ground. I call it, affectionately, the Walter cycle. It's like a water cycle, but within the wall. George has given us a specific physical mechanism to pump water into the interior of the wall, and he gives us tons of hints at this at the Nightfort. Let me explain. When Bran, Mira, and Jojen visit the Nightfort, they stay in the abandoned kitchens, which are a huge central well surrounded by, kitchen-y stuff, ovens, meat hooks, butcher's blocks, and then next to the well there is a slanted weirwood, the skinniest weirwood Bran has ever seen, growing at an angle out from near the central well, breaking up through the floor, right? And this well is terrifying, unnaturally terrifying, so terrifying that it doesn't make any sense, and we'll get back to this later. But Bran is in the Rat Cook's kitchen. This is where all of the ghost stories he heard growing up took place. This specific castle is like the home to like 7 different ghost stories that Bran heard growing up. And he sees the ovens where he knows the Rat Cook cooked the prince into a pie. He sees the butcher's block where he in his head knows the prince was cut up, and yet the thing he's most scared of is this well. And as I said, we'll have to get back to that. But this well, as I said, is a long 12-foot wide shaft that goes all the way down with stone stairs constructed in the middle of it. And when you get partway down the shaft, there is the Black Gate, which is a giant weirwood face that you can go in and out of. When you go out of it, you are beyond the wall, and when you go into it, you enter into the shaft of this well. Alright, that's important. You go into the mouth of the weirwood, and you are inside this long white shaft. Because the shaft of the well is described as damp and covered in niter. Niter is a white buildup, alright? But niter is a highly water-soluble white buildup that generally forms in arid locations. Meaning, it's probably not actually niter, it just is a white buildup, and it's damp. And at the bottom of the well, there is water, because they throw stone down there. And water is at the bottom, so far down that they're able to have a little conversation before they hear the stone actually hit the water. The well shaft is a weirwood trunk, guys. Think about it. Think about everything George has lined up here. It is a giant white shaft with a weirwood face partway down. Weirwood faces are carved into the trunks of trees. There is a giant weirwood face here because this is a giant trunk of a tree. The reason that the weirwood bursting up from the floor of the kitchen at the Nightfort next to the central well is described as the skinniest Bran has ever seen, and at an angle slantwise is because it's a branch. It's a branch of a giant redwood-sized weirwood, but still skinnier than any weirwood trunk Bran would have ever seen because it's just a branch. Breaking up through the floor of this kitchen in the 200 years since the Nightfort has been abandoned, this weirwood that was turned into this well is regrowing. It is seeping through the interior stones that were constructed, and it looks like niter, but it's actually the weirwood just encasing the stone and retaking, growing out through it. And the branch sticking up through the floor is not a skinny tree, it is a branch. So, let's just take that into account. We have, in at least one case, a giant weirwood inside the wall itself that seems to be very old and a part of the wall. And what is it? It is damp. It is always described as damp. The well shaft is damp, and when they go out the black gate, Bran bumps his head on the bit of the door that Hodor doesn't duck quite enough, and he hits the lip of the door, and a bit of water drips down onto his face. It's the last lines of the chapter. George makes specific note of the fact that when Bran goes out through the black gate, there is water flowing through that black gate. There is water that literally leaks out onto Bran's face because this thing is a weirwood that has water running through it. Why? Because what do trees do? Trees pump water from their roots up the trunk and out their branches to hydrate their leaves. If you have weirwood trees planted the size of redwoods within the wall, which we see one of, the only time we get a real good glimpse at the interior of the wall is at the old ruins of the Nightfort, the oldest castle on the wall, and we get a clear view of a redwood-sized weirwood within the wall. So if you have these weirwood organisms running through the wall, connected to the underground rivers and streams and water sources that we are constantly reminded of throughout this story, they will act as a water pump, endlessly doing what trees do, which is pumping water from underground and up through themselves. And if they run like veins throughout the wall, you have created a circulatory system that feeds water into the interior of the wall, where glaciation can take over and rebuild the wall from the inside out. I feel like I should mention the heart tree is a heart because it pumps blood into the wall and pumps water into the wall. It pumps the circulatory system, it powers the circulatory system. That is why they are called heart trees. It's another clue in plain sight. Heck, you could consider this theory the heart tree theory. There is a heart tree pumping blood into the wall, potentially a bunch of heart trees pumping the circulatory system of the wall. All of it tracks with what George is giving us, every bit of it. I mean, it's right there. He put it right there, and we didn't figure it out. I didn't figure it out until like a month ago. It's a heart tree. There's a circulatory system. The wall is alive. But there is one extra piece that's even more interesting. What brings the cold in the first place? How does the wall freeze once that water is pumped up through this line of weirwoods? That is probably how the wall was created. We'll get through that right now. We're far enough into the video. You've waited long enough. The wall was built by growing a giant line of weirwoods connected to these underground water sources, having them pump the water up to the top and having it freeze, engulfing this tree line in ice, and then eventually the ice just pushes out and pushes out and pushes out until you have a giant wall of ice that is impassable and magically warded because its true form is a line of weirwoods, not a wall of ice. It is a line of weirwoods in an ice shell, which is why the wall goes from 700 to 900 feet tall, rising and falling like a tree line would. If you look at a tree line and then you look at how the wall is described, the top of the wall is just like the top of a tree line because it is a tree line covered in ice. But the source of the cold is one of the most interesting parts, and it's what really kind of brings everything together. In the very beginning of the story, it is made very clear that the others bring the cold. When Waymar Royce is fighting another, before he even sees it, before anyone has seen the others in the story, he starts asking, why is it so cold? And Will has scrambled his way up a sentinel tree, and he's hiding there, hugging the tree, and the sap is pressing to his face, and it is cold out. It gets very cold, even though the wall was described as weeping, and they were talking earlier in the chapter how it was not cold. The very proximity of the others brings the cold. And that is why many people speculated in the past, maybe the others created the wall. Maybe the others helped create the wall. Well, I'll say this, the others' magic is in the wall, but the others did not help create the wall. It is much darker than that. In the television show, we saw how the others were created. There was a man strapped to a weirwood crucifixion style, and a magic spell was done on him, and you could say that's only the television show, which is why I'm now going to pull up these book quotes for you. When Sam the Slayer has slayed another, he is returning, and people poke fun at him by suggesting, "Are you sure you've killed another and not some child's Snow Knight?" Referring in foreshadowing ways to the fact that, yes, the children created Snow Knights. Another one that's more concrete than that is Asha Greyjoy. When she sees a line of trees, she thinks that the trees are creeping towards the castle wall like a green army, and it reminds her of the story she heard from the Age of Heroes when the children turned the trees into warriors. There's a story of the time the children turned the trees into warriors because the children turned the trees into warriors, a weapon to fight mankind. And the very first line where we see an other in the story is, "A shadow emerged from the dark of the wood and stood in front of Royce." And then he describes the other. But it is foreshadowing. You get bonus points when you are writing a story if the first time you introduce your big bad, you have some hint about their true nature, right? So when George says a shadow emerged from the dark of the wood, he's describing it that way because the others are quite literally a shadow that emerged from the dark of the wood. The others were created the way we saw in the television show, strapped to weirwoods, and then the spirits from the weirwoods were pulled into these physical bodies. But what if you never untied them? That's right, George has not only given us a physical mechanism powered by magic, admittedly, but one which you can pump water up through the weirwoods, and also one which you can create ice demons from, which their very proximity freezes the water. A bold claim, and one which I'm sure you would like a little bit of evidence for. So is there any evidence that there is in fact an other strapped to this weirwood? Well, yes, there is. When Bran is at the Nightfort, remember, he is more scared of this well than he is of anything else at the Nightfort, despite the fact that he has grown up hearing ghost stories about everything else at the Nightfort and has never heard of this well, right? What do the others bring besides cold? They bring fear. Bran gets near this well and is so scared of it he doesn't want to stay by it. He says he can feel the cold seeping up from below the slate floor next to this thing. He says you will never get warm here, and he's terrified of it, unnaturally so. He has, as I said, heard ghost stories about everything else in this kitchen, and yet he's most scared of this well. That is for a reason. It's meant to stick out to you, and it is freaking weird if there is not a massive source of fear within this well somewhere. And I just personally think there's a lot of hints that are all pointing in the same direction, both physical hints, foreshadowing hints, and the fact that this is how the magic works, right? I will go into all the foreshadowing here in a moment, but we have to acknowledge we have a mechanism by which water can be pumped up into the wall, and a mechanism by which water can be frozen, and those things are connected. they could easily be, both of which together, the thing that powers the wall. If there are others bound to the weirwoods crucifixion style, and these weirwoods run throughout the entirety of the wall, like a circulatory system, that's a lot like what Daenerys dealt with when she saw people, and specifically children, crucified as mile markers. If the others are perhaps children of the forest who were turned into others, that would be a very direct parallel. If they had to take their own kind and turn them into others, and that's how they turned the trees into warriors, perhaps there are literally crucified children as mile markers within the wall. But even if they aren't children, on the other side, there is the fact that Daenerys learned that when you crucify bad people, she comes in, she takes the slave masters who were doing bad things and crucifies them. That's still not good either, because it leads to retribution down the line. People come back and try to destabilize Daenerys because she crucified their family. If the others are coming back and trying to bring down the wall and attack humanity because we crucified their family, or part of their hive mind is still crucified within this wall, that's a very interesting conflict. And it would mirror Daenerys' story, and it would mirror Jon's story, where he goes north of the wall, meets the wildlings, realizes, hey, wait a minute, if this big wall wasn't in the way, we could all get along a lot better, and maybe we wouldn't need to fight anymore. And then many people speculate that there's going to have to be some sort of resolution to the story that isn't just, oh, there's a big war and we win the war. Well, that would be a good resolution point, is if the resolution needs to be the wall needs to be brought down in some fashion. We'll get to that in a later video in this series. This is going to be a series because I have a lot of thoughts, and this was kind of a missing piece that allowed me to put a lot of them together, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. But we're not quite done yet, because there is more speculation, and I know this is a wild claim to suggest the wall was grown in a line of weirwoods by Bran the Builder with the help of the children, perhaps the giants as well, as the stories say. They grew a line of weirwoods, and then they did the magic that creates the others, but left them bound there, thus creating a forever magical ward. It's possible they did it that way, it's possible they somehow captured others in the actual war against them, and took literal prisoners of war and crucified them to these trees. That's also compelling, but I think if we have direct visual of a spirit being pulled from the wood into a human body while that human is strapped to a weirwood, even if it was in the late seasons of the television show, I'm going to use that as a hint to lean in the direction of that's how they did it. They strapped people or children of the forest to these weirwoods crucifixion style and pulled the others' spirits from the weirwood itself into this physical body. But do we have any sort of foreshadowing of prisoners of war, or anyone really, being trapped in the wall forever? Well, yes, we do. We have the 79 Sentinels, who are very specifically, much like the others, coded with tree symbolism and tree metaphor, because Sentinels in A Song of Ice and Fire are one of the most common types of trees that George refers to. He always is referring to the sentinel trees are doing this, someone was doing that underneath a sentinel tree. They are literally, like, not maybe as common as weirwoods, but they're up there, right? Ironwoods, sentinel trees, weirwoods. George loves them. In the very prologue itself, the tree that Will climbs up is very specifically a sentinel tree. That's where he is when he sees the others. So the 79 Sentinels, with their tree people symbolism, are Night's Watch deserters, so people who did a bad thing, and their punishment was, we are going to stick you in the wall forever. They put these people into the wall, they carved holes in it, put people in there, gave them a spear, gave them a horn, and froze them into the wall forever. So in theory, they would stand watch forever facing north. That's some foreshadowing that there might be tree people trapped in the wall forever as a punishment. So in the next part of this series, I'm going to explain in great detail how the old ways were set up as a giant system to essentially keep this Weirwood magic powered and keep the others away. There's a ton of details about that. We'll have book quotes. We'll have even more evidence for this theory coming in later parts. I just don't want this whole video to be over an hour long, so it's going to be a fun series. So make sure you hit that subscribe button as I said. But before we end it here, I do want to give just a little bit of time to an alternative theory of this because, okay, so I've imagined it as a line of weirwoods within the wall, like a big circulatory system pumping the water. I think that makes sense. But one other thing that is worth noting is how much world tree symbolism there is with this tree at the Nightfort, this well shaft. There is a well at the bottom of the world tree, right? This well at the Nightfort feels like an almost corrupted world tree. It is scary, it is corrupted. Being near it is terrifying. It is a gigantic tree that is, it's got a well at the bottom like the world tree, right? And Melisandre describes the Nightfort in an unused chapter, in an unused version of a chapter. She describes it as the heart of your wall, which is one of the hinges of the world as she describes it. There's a ton of world tree symbolism around the well at the Nightfort because the well at the Nightfort is a tree. It's a giant world tree-like tree. It is possible that this is the source of all of the wall, right? It's possible that using glaciation, George has designed the wall where there is one giant tree that pumps the water up and it just spreads out slowly. I think personally that makes less sense, but maybe that's what George is going for. I wanted to just give that notion a bit of time at the end of this video because I do think that could make sense, but I still personally think it's more likely that the wall is a tree line, not just one world tree in the middle there at the Nightfort. But I wanted to throw it out there just because, as I said, there's a lot of world tree symbolism going on with that tree, and the world tree kind of implies like one world tree, and Melisandre describing the Nightfort as the heart of the wall. If all of the blood for the wall pumps through there, right? If the Black Gate is the only one, and it's like the only weirwood within the wall, and it all pumps from there and flows out, I could see that, but that just means it's pumping a lot of water. But as we've seen, the entire well shaft is damp. Bumping into it, you get water leaking out onto you, so it's water's leaking out of it everywhere. There are weirwoods within the wall, pumping and leaking out water, leaking into the interior of the wall. Confirmed. The nature of them, up for debate. So that's the main thing I wanted to get across in part 1. Stay tuned for part 2, where we talk even more about all of this fun stuff. And honestly, there's probably going to be 3, maybe even 4 parts to this series, so you're not going to want to miss it. See you all very soon.